large Russian convoy was struck by a Ukrainian FPV drone, but the first vehicle to catch fire may not be the most serious part of the story. At first glance, it may look like just another familiar strike on a battlefield, already filled with convoys stopped in the open, assaults broken early, and soldiers forced to abandon formation and find their own way to survive. But this sequence does not appear to end with a single precise hit. It unfolds in a far more dangerous way. So what happened after that Ukrainian FPV drone struck the large Russian convoy? And why does what followed suggest that this may be more than an isolated attack, but a glimpse into how modern warfare is changing on the battlefield in Ukraine? Stay with Military Force to find out. Ukraine opened this small battle with a method that now defines much of the war at the tactical level. A reconnaissance drone spotted Russian infantry first, kept the group under observation, and relayed coordinates almost at once. That quick transfer allowed an FPV drone to move in from a favorable direction and strike before the soldiers below had any real chance to adjust. What made the moment important was not only the hit, but the speed of the sequence. Detection, tracking, data transfer, and impact were compressed into a very short span. That left little room for cover, confusion, or escape. In practical terms, two drones performed two linked roles inside one combat process. One platform searched, confirmed, and guided. The second delivered the strike. The exchange showed how a battle can begin without a large clash, because pressure now starts the moment a target is seen. In that kind of environment, the side that sees first can shape the first minutes, and the first minutes often shape everything after. Russian infantry at the front therefore entered the fight exposed to a system that joined awareness to attack with speed. They were not simply moving toward danger, they were moving inside it. That early disadvantage mattered, because once Ukraine set the tempo at the smallest level, the layer of the engagement became easier to exploit. This opening phase also revealed something larger than the loss of several men in the field. Ukraine did not need a heavy barrage or a long preparation cycle to begin controlling the encounter. The first source of pressure came from information. Once Russian troops were located, the battlefield around them changed at once. Ground that may have looked safe enough to cross for a few seconds became dangerous because observation was already tied to action. That is why the episode matters beyond a single strike video. It showed that a minor contact can be turned into an organized kill chain in minutes. The importance of that pattern lies in what it does to momentum. A force that loses forward infantry early does not only suffer casualties, it also loses confidence, timing, and freedom of movement. Those losses are harder to measure than destroyed vehicles, but they often matter just as much at the start of a fight. By hitting the leading infantry first, Ukraine did more than remove exposed troops. It established rhythm. It forced the Russian side to react instead of dictate events. And once that rhythm was set at the infantry level, the path was opened for Ukrainian pressure to move on to the larger assault element, advancing behind them. That shift would define the next stage of the fight before the attack formed. The clash near Lyman shows how a mechanized attack can begin to fail before it reaches direct contact. Russian forces moved forward with armored vehicles, transport, and infantry in what should have been an assault. This type of formation relies on timing, spacing, and controlled movement to stay effective. In this case, pressure arrived early enough that the formation never fully stabilized. Vehicles were expected to move at a pace and deliver troops at the right moment. Once that sequence is disturbed, the structure begins to weaken. The problem did not start at the objective itself. It started on the road leading toward it, where the attack was still forming. That early disruption meant the assault entered the battlefield under strain. The leading vehicles absorbed the first hits, and this immediately affected everything behind them. Some vehicles slowed down. Others changed position or hesitated on the route. That hesitation created gaps and uncertainty inside the column. A mechanized push depends on continuous movement, because delay increases exposure. The road that should carry force forward becomes a place where risk builds quickly. Instead of moving as a single unit, the column begins to stretch and lose order. Each vehicle behind the front inherits both danger and confusion at the same time. This shift is critical because it changes the role of the approach route. Movement is no longer an advantage. It becomes a liability that exposes the force step by step. This loss of rhythm has a psychological effect that is easy to miss. Crews behind the damaged lead vehicles no longer move with the confidence of an advancing force. They move with the fear that every pause may expose them to the next strike. That fear slows decision-making and weakens coordination. In a mechanized assault, those small delays accumulate quickly. A few seconds become a missed turn. A missed turn becomes a traffic jam. And that traffic jam becomes a target zone. This breakdown forced Russian infantry into a difficult situation. Troops had to leave their vehicles under poor conditions. They lost protection and control over when and how they entered the fight. If they dismounted too early, they lost armored cover and momentum. If they stayed inside, they risked being trapped in damaged or stalled vehicles. Neither option supported an organized advance. Instead of arriving as a coordinated force, infantry entered the battlefield in scattered groups. This changes how the assault functions. A mechanized attack is designed to deliver pressure in a structured way. Once troops are separated, that structure disappears. The operation begins to look like isolated movements rather than a unified push. Scattered infantry face a different kind of battlefield problem. Without a stable vehicle screen, they become more dependent on personal judgment and local decisions. That makes it harder to keep alignment with nearby units. Under those conditions, even short movement across open or semi-covered ground becomes more dangerous. The infantry may still be present on the battlefield, but their combat value starts to fall once coordination breaks. The fight near Lyman matters because of what it reveals beyond losses. Destroyed vehicles are only the most obvious result. The deeper issue is the loss of attacking rhythm. When a force cannot maintain speed, spacing, and coordination, it loses its main advantage. Armor and infantry depend on each other to create pressure. If that link breaks, the assault weakens even before reaching the target. Ukraine did not need to destroy every vehicle to achieve this effect. Breaking the sequence at the right moment was enough. The approach phase became the decisive phase of the battle. This meant the Russian assault was already compromised before it could fully develop. And once the formation lost structure, the battlefield became more dangerous for those who remained. Once the Russian assault formation near Lyman lost cohesion, the battle entered a more dangerous phase for the troops who survived the first disruption. Burning vehicles were no longer the center of the action. The focus shifted to the men forced out of those vehicles and into open ground, shallow cover, or temporary hiding places. This is where fiber optic drones became especially important. Unlike many standard unmanned systems, they are much less vulnerable to the electronic interference that shapes much of the front. That gave Ukrainian operators a way to keep pressure on Russian infantry, even after the first clash had scattered them across the field. In practical terms, the battle did not end when the convoy or assault group stopped moving. It simply changed scale. In older battlefield conditions, soldiers who escaped a damaged vehicle could still hope that distance, confusion, or a quick move to the rear might restore some chance of survival. Here, that assumption appears much weaker. Small groups and even single men still remained exposed to detection and attack after the main assault had already begun to fail. Some likely tried to reach tree lines, shell holes, ruined structures, or any depression in the ground that looked safer than open terrain. Yet the battlefield had not become quieter after the first strikes. It had become more selective. Ukrainian drone teams were no longer dealing mainly with moving armor. They were now hunting the men who might otherwise regroup and preserve part of the attack. That makes the pursuit phase central to the outcome of the whole engagement, because men who survive the first blast can still carry rifles, report positions, and form the nucleus of a local defense if they are given time. Instead, this method keeps pressure on them before shock turns into recovery, and before disorder hardens into a new line that could slow the next Ukrainian move. That makes this stage operationally significant rather than incidental. That shift matters because it changes the meaning of survival. Escaping a damaged vehicle is no longer enough. Reaching shallow cover is no longer enough. Even creating a short break in contact may no longer be enough if the side applying pressure can still follow movement through a heavily contested electronic environment. This is why fiber optic drones matter beyond their technical novelty. Their importance lies in reducing one of the few remaining defenses scattered infantry still hopes to use. If electronic interference cannot reliably break the pursuit, then the burden on the soldier below becomes much heavier. Movement must be faster. Concealment must be better. Decisions must be made under stress with less confidence that the sky above has gone blind. That pressure produces direct tactical effects. Scattered infantry cannot easily rebuild command links, restore direction, or re-establish mutual support. A group that is hiding is not preparing a new push. A group that is running is not holding ground with confidence. A group that is constantly looking upward is not thinking clearly about its next move. So this stage of the fight was about more than casualties. It was about denying recovery. Ukraine appears to have understood that breaking the mechanized thrust was only the first half of the task. The second half was to prevent the surviving troops from turning a failed approach into a smaller but still dangerous presence on the ground. And once that control is established against exposed infantry, the logic of the operation naturally points toward larger and more valuable targets deeper behind the line. The strike on the Nebo radar marked a clear shift in the meaning of this operation. Until that point, the pressure had fallen mainly on Russian forces moving at the tactical edge of the battlefield. With Nebo now in focus, the fight expanded beyond exposed infantry and disrupted assault elements into a deeper layer of Russian military capacity. That matters because Nebo is not simply another vehicle or launcher. It is part of the early warning structure that helps Russian air defenses detect threats at range and maintain awareness across wider airspace. A system like that does more than watch the sky. It helps commanders build a picture of what may be approaching, from which direction, and how quickly defensive assets may need to respond. Once such a radar is damaged or disabled, the loss is measured in more than hardware. The larger loss is reduced visibility at a moment when visibility shapes every later decision. That is why the Nebo strike carries more weight than a normal equipment loss. Ukraine was no longer acting only against the moving edge of an assault. It was reaching for one of the systems that helps Russia connect warning, tracking, and response over distance. In military terms, this is a move from fighting units to fighting functions. The target was valuable not just because it was rare or costly, but because it supported the wider logic of Russian defensive control. By hitting Nebo, Ukraine showed that this was no longer only a contest over one road, one approach route, or one strip of ground. It became a contest over awareness behind the line as well. That shift expands the scale of the battle without requiring a major offensive. A single chosen strike against a strategic sensor can alter the conditions under which later actions unfold. If awareness drops, uncertainty rises. If uncertainty rises, reaction slows. If reaction slows, every asset that depends on early warning becomes harder to manage. That changes how each later move must be calculated. This does not mean one radar strike can collapse an entire air defense network. It does mean that a clash becomes more serious when it starts to touch the tools that support command judgment and battlefield coverage. That is what makes this phase of the operation important. Ukraine showed that it could move from attacking immediate threats to attacking the framework that helps Russia interpret the battlefield itself. The fight was no longer confined to what soldiers could see in front of them. It was beginning to affect how Russian forces saw the battle space around them. That changes the character of the campaign. A force under pressure at the front can still try to recover if deeper systems remain intact and informed. But once the tools that support warning and coordination also come under attack, recovery becomes harder and risk becomes more difficult to control. So the Nebo strike was not only about damaging one radar. It was about widening the battle and proving that Ukraine could reach into a more valuable layer of Russian military organization. And once that deeper reach had been demonstrated, the next question was whether the same pressure could also shape Russian movement on the ground. Before dawn, another Russian convoy appears to have entered the area with the assumption that movement would protect it. Instead, movement became the very condition that exposed it. Ukrainian forces detected the column early and then struck both the front and the rear, turning a moving formation into a trapped line of vehicles. That detail is central to understanding this phase of the battle. A convoy can survive danger when it still has room to accelerate, disperse, or reverse direction. Once the lead element is hit and the rear is blocked, those choices shrink at once. The vehicles in the middle are left with almost no freedom. They are no longer part of a flexible advance. They become part of a bottleneck that grows more dangerous with each passing minute and under constant observation. This is why the timing of the strike mattered so much. The attack came before full daylight, while the Russian force was still caught between movement and deployment. That is one of the weakest moments for any column in combat. A force on the move has not yet formed a defensive posture. A force preparing to deploy has not yet spread out enough to reduce risk. Pressure in that narrow window can travel through the whole formation very quickly. The later destruction of a tank appears to have settled the question of whether the incursion could still continue. By that point, the issue was no longer whether Russian troops could keep advancing. The real issue was whether enough of them could pull back before the situation became even worse. That change in purpose is crucial. An attacking force enters with plans to push forward and hold ground. A retreating force thinks first about saving what remains under sustained pressure and growing uncertainty. The episode reveals a clear rule of this small operation. Ukraine was not only selecting targets, it was selecting the moment when those targets would have the least room to adapt. That is a powerful form of battlefield control. It means the outcome is shaped not only by what gets hit, but by when a force loses the ability to move freely. From the mechanized thrust disrupted near Lyman to the convoy trapped before sunrise, the same logic appeared again. Ukrainian forces were not simply destroying vehicles one by one. They were controlling the tempo of Russian movement and turning transit into exposure. The convoy was not defeated only by firepower. It was defeated by the loss of options. Once the route ahead was broken and the path behind was denied, every remaining vehicle carried the same burden under pressure. Stay in place and risk another strike. Move in panic and increase disorder. Either choice favored the defender. Once both frontline elements and reinforcing columns could no longer travel with confidence, this clash began to point beyond the immediate road. It began to suggest that the battle was expanding toward the deeper systems that helped Russia sustain pressure behind the front. Ukraine's strikes on the Tor system and the Shahed depot showed that this was no longer only a fight against forces moving at the front. The battle had widened into a contest over the tools that help Russia protect its rear and sustain pressure beyond the combat zone. That matters because Tor is not simply another battlefield asset. It is a defensive system designed to detect and destroy threats in the air before they reach more valuable targets. When a system like that is found and destroyed by a drone, the meaning goes beyond a single equipment loss. It shows that the protective layer behind the line can also be pulled into the same sequence of detection and strike. The attack on the Shahed depot pushed this logic further. A depot like that is not only a storage point for unmanned systems, it is part of the chain that supports repeated attacks on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Striking it was therefore not just about destroying hardware on the ground. It was about weakening the process through which later attacks could be prepared and launched. This gave the operation a broader meaning than a local battlefield success. The same campaign that had already disrupted infantry and slowed mechanized movement was now reaching deeper systems. In that sense, the fight was stretching from a small tactical clash into a wider contest over military endurance. At the same time, Russia has continued large Shahed attacks against infrastructure and populated areas. That shows the war is no longer defined only by what happens where troops meet directly. It is also shaped by what happens far from the immediate line of contact. Power systems, urban life, and public stability all become part of the battlefield today across regions. But the methods remain different in focus. In this sequence, Ukraine concentrated on military functions that support surveillance, protection, and drone operations. Russia's Shahed campaign has spread danger across civilian spaces as well as infrastructure. The larger lesson is that modern war now unfolds through linked strikes across different layers. Infantry, convoys, radar, air defense, and drone logistics are now part of one system. That is why this episode matters. What remains is not just a list of damaged targets. It is a clearer view of how one small campaign can reflect the changing shape of the war. This small campaign revealed a larger truth about how the war is changing. It began with detected infantry, widened through a broken mechanized push, and then moved into pursuit and deeper strikes. That sequence matters because drones are no longer supporting the battle from the edges. They are now shaping its opening, its tempo, and its expansion. Ukraine showed how several short attacks can be linked into one controlled operation that steadily strips the opponent of movement, awareness, and recovery time. Russia answered with large Shahed attacks on the rear, which means the struggle now extends far beyond roads and frontline positions. What remains after this episode is not only wreckage or losses. It is evidence that modern war increasingly favors the side that can find first, track longer, strike faster, and repeat the cycle before the other side can recover. That is the deeper lesson of this fight. If this analysis helped you understand not just how war is fought, but why its human cost matters, subscribe to Military Force. The more clearly we see the mechanics of conflict, the more seriously we can value the importance of peace. Stay informed, stay thoughtful, and follow Military Force for deeper reporting on the battles shaping today's world.